Hi, thanks for taking the time to join me in my study today. This week, I've continued to write my scholarly book on the doctrine of the Atonement. I'm using my shorter book, Elements of the Atonement, as a sort of skeletal outline for the larger book and then fleshing it out as I go along. It's a tedious process, and so far I've managed to complete 3 chapters. Chapter 1 is an introductory chapter, and the most significant insight that I share in this chapter are the 2 different definitions of the atonement. The word atonement can be used in a very broad sense to mean simply reconciliation with God, but it's also used in the Old Testament in a narrower sense to mean to cleanse or purify of either sin or impurity. And these 2 senses of the atonement are very different and need to be teased apart if we're to get a handle on this doctrine. It's possible, as some have actually done, to write an entire book on the atonement in the broad general sense and never really discuss atonement in the biblical sense of cleansing or purifying from sin. In the 2nd chapter, I then discuss Old Testament sacrifice and the role of the Old Testament sacrifices in propitiating God's wrath and in expiating our sin. I think probably the most interesting thing about this chapter that arose from my writing it is the degree to which the motif of ransom plays a role in these Old Testament sacrifices. In Leviticus 17:11, it lays down the general principle for these animal sacrifices. It says that the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your lives, because it is the blood that makes atonement by reason of the life. And here the word for make atonement, kippur, means to ransom. I have given you this blood on the altar to ransom your lives. So the blood serves to redeem or rescue people from sin and impurity, and so to reconcile them to God. And then the 3rd chapter that I've completed is on Isaiah 53. This remarkable chapter on the servant of the Lord, this enigmatic figure who stands in Israel's place and falls under the judgment of God for Israel's sins. And what I try to show in this chapter is that the suffering of the servant of the Lord is, first of all, vicarious. That is to say, he suffers instead of the people. And then secondly, that this suffering is punitive. That is to say, God is punishing the servant for the sins of the people. So, extraordinary as it is, in Isaiah 53, you actually have a doctrine of substitutionary punishment, or in other words, penal substitution taught with regard to the servant. And I close out this chapter by showing how in the New Testament, over and over again, Jesus is identified with the suffering servant of the Lord in Isaiah 53. In fact, it surprised me to find that at the time of his arrest, Jesus quotes Isaiah 53, where it says, he must be reckoned with the lawless. And he says, this scripture is now being fulfilled in me. So Jesus himself thought of himself as the servant of the Lord, of Isaiah 53, taking the judgment that was due to Israel upon himself, and so atoning for their sins. The chapter I'm working on now, chapter 4, is on divine justice, and I'll be especially focusing on Paul's doctrine of justification and how the atonement plays a role in that.